Hi, everyone. I'm Susie from Columbia Land Trust again, and I'm here to talk to you about naturescaping with native plants. In this session, we are going to cover, I'm going to share my screen here with you. We're going to cover the why of native plants, plant and site conditions, canopy layers, pollinators, calculating naturescaped areas, and additional learning opportunities. First, I'm going to set a foundation by addressing a few things about the program that can be a little confusing. The first is the misconception that we require people to plant only native plants. That's not true. People want to use their yards for a lot of different things like hanging out, growing food, growing their favorite ornamental blooms. We encourage people to create pockets of habitat in portions of their yard, or if they're really into it, they can certainly dedicate larger portions of their yard to it. The beauty of native plants is that they go really well with the other things you want to do in your yard. They support pollinators like bees and other beneficial insects, which are great for folks who want to grow food. And they also support birds, which make hanging out in your yard a lot more fun. So there are lots of good reasons to dedicate a corner of your yard to native plants. And we'll talk more later on about the different certification levels and what kind of naturescaping is required for those. For now, let's move on to a second thing that can be a little confusing, and that's the term naturescaping, which is used in different ways. In our program, we try to be really consistent. Generally, out in the world, it's used to mean gardening with techniques that emulate nature, including planting native plants. For our program, we refer to naturescaping as having planting areas where a majority of the plants are native and where there are multiple canopy layers. Trees, shrubs, ground cover, like smaller plants, and grasses are all different canopy layers. We'll cover a bit more of that in future slides. Another thing that can be a little confusing is that the term native plants gets thrown out a lot, gets used a lot, and in many different ways. So generally it refers to plant species that were here before European colonization. So outside the program, you may hear the term being used to refer to plants that are native to the state of Oregon or even native to the entire US. For purposes of our program, what we mean is that they're native to the lower Willamette Valley, which you can see in this map is encircled by this red dashed line or circle. So luckily we have a really great resource in this area called the Portland Plant List that tells us exactly what plants have grown historically inside this circle. And one thing to know about the Portland Plant List is that even though it was created by the city of Portland, but it's actually good to use throughout this entire Portland, Vancouver metro area. So don't be biased by the name if you're not in Portland. It's really great for Hillsborough and Gresham and Vancouver or Camas or anywhere in Clark County, all the way down into Wilsonville. And one thing that can be really confusing is that when you go to local nurseries, they might have a section of their store that's dedicated to native plants. But again, their definition of native plants might be different than what ours is. So they will very likely in their native plant section have things that are outside of this lower Willamette Valley area. And here is a look at the front page of the Portland Plant List right here. And so again, plants on the Portland Plant List are what we're looking for when we go out to certify sites. So it's good to get to know the most commonly planted ones. Near the end of this presentation, I'll be providing some plant ID resources that can help you with that. Some of these plants on this list, this document is about 202 pages long, but there's really just one section in it, section 3.1, which I've highlighted right here, that is the list of plants that we use. And honestly, some of them are really hard to find at nurseries because they are plants that are really finicky. Maybe they're hard to propagate and grow in a way that they're easy to sell at nurseries. Or maybe once they are transplanted into your yard or your neighbor's yard, maybe they don't do so well because they need really specific conditions. So a good thing to do is get to know the Metro Native Plant Brochure, which again, I'll provide a link for that at the end of the presentation, and the City of Portland Native Plant Poster, which you can also find online. Those two are really great resources for learning kind of smaller subsets of native plants. And they also have photos and images that are helpful as well. One thing to note is that Portland Audubon store does sell hard copies of the Portland plant list. It's not listed on their online order page, but you can call them and order it and then go pick it up, or you can buy it in person. All right, so I'm talking a lot about native plants. Why do we focus so much on native species? Well, for one thing, they're adapted to the climate here, so they live healthier lives in the ground and require less maintenance, less water, and they don't get nearly as many pests either, so you don't have to use pesticides and herbicides. Another big reason is that research shows they're significantly better at supporting local wildlife. Native plants and animals have lived here for thousands of years and have adapted to each other over time and have developed symbiotic relationships. So birds and insects are heavily reliant on native plants because they've spent so long adapting to them and creating this symbiotic relationship. You can see in this slide that 90% of insects depend on native plants to survive. So that's one food chain level, right? And then 96% of birds feed on insects, specifically when they're feeding their young. And so that's another food chain level. So there's really a food chain interaction that's happening here when you plant native plants. Another reason for native plants is that they're exceptional at absorbing rainwater, reducing soil erosion, and absorbing carbon. In particular, native grasses have extensive root systems that improve the soil so it can infiltrate water better. Native plants have greater biomass, which means their roots and everything that's happening underground below the surface, and therefore sequester large amounts of carbon. So in this illustration, you can see way over here on the left is turf grass, so lawn basically. And compared to these other native plants, native forbs and grasses, the turf has a very shallow root system. So it's not providing any food for wildlife, and it's not even absorbing, it does absorb rainwater, but it doesn't contribute to the cleaning of water, and it doesn't absorb nearly as much, and it doesn't prevent soil erosion and so forth, compared with the native plants. All right, so when you go to the nursery, you'll find often, if they have a native plant section, that they've included cultivars and hybrids in that native plant section. So I wanted to cover this a little bit. So what are cultivars and hybrids? You've probably heard of these terms before, but you might not know exactly what they mean. So a cultivar is basically a plant variety that's bred for its specific traits. So at some point, they took a native plant and they said, we love the color of this bloom, but we want it to be a little bit of a different shade. So they breed it. They have a way to breed it so that it enhances that specific trait, or it changes that different trait. And so things that are often done as cultivars is they change the bloom color. The bloom color can be changed. Or they can be modified to have longer bloom times. because what's better than having flowers that bloom for longer? I mean, I get it. And also different bloom shapes. So that's in essence what a cultivar is. And then a hybrid is similar but different. A hybrid is when you take two species and you cross-pollinate them to come up with a new species. And you can, like, this is kind of a tricky thing to describe without spending a lot of time on it. So feel free to do Google searches. There is some good information out there that can help you kind of understand the differences. So there are thousands, if not more, of cultivars and hybrids out there, and new ones coming out each year. And no one yet has undertaken the overwhelming task of researching these cultivars and hybrids to determine how the changes they've made to the plants impact the animals that rely on them for food, whether it be for nectar or laying their eggs on the stems or leaves. And so, you know, birds, bees, and pollinators are drawn to specific colors and require specifically sized bloom shapes and bloom sizes. So it could be that changing, for example, a red flowering currant, which is one of my favorite spring bloomers, if they change that bright fuchsia color that the red flowering currant has to have flowers that are instead white, it could be that like hummingbirds no longer see them because they have this like specific color they're looking for, or a specific spectrum of colors that they're looking for. And the red flowering currant no longer fits into that color spectrum, even though normally the red flowering currant is one of their favorite nectar plants. And so, you know, many cultivars and hybrids probably do have some wildlife benefits, but there are just too many variables that haven't been studied. So for purposes of our program, we take the safe side and we really promote the plants that we know research has been done on and we know are really beneficial for wildlife. And those are native plants that have not been modified. So, you know, we're not saying that cultivars are bad at all. We're just saying that we don't know enough about them. So we're focusing on non-cultivated native plants. Some of these things can be confusing. So I also want to mention that, you know, feel free to write down your questions and bring them with you to one of our live question and answer sessions. I think we have 4 or so different sessions in April. And so write down your questions throughout this video, and please bring those with you because that's what those sessions are meant to do, is answer all of your questions. And I know some of this stuff can be a little confusing. So, all right, so how do you identify a cultivar? Say you do go to the nursery and you want to make sure that you get what they call a straight species rather than a cultivar. Usually what the easiest way to kind of identify a cultivar is to look at the name of the common name for the plant, or sorry, the botanical name for the plant. So for instance, you know, this particular plant right here is a cultivar lupin. So it's a lupin, but it's been cultivated to have blooms that it doesn't naturally come in. They're beautiful blooms, and the blooms may last longer, I'm not sure. But if you were to look at the tag for this plant, it would say lupinus, which is the botanical name for lupin. And then it would have parentheses, the chatelaine. So when you see a name that has parentheses like this, that means that it's a cultivar. Usually cultivars are named after the person who cultivated it, or after a particular feature of the plant, such as the color or bloom time. You can also always ask you can also always ask the staff there at the nursery. Okay, and then what about identifying hybrids? Well, similarly, since these have been crossbred, they have different colors, shapes, sizes than native plants. But in this case, you also look at the name, but you can look for an X. An X means that it's been cross-pollinated. So then you know that it's a hybrid. So in this case, what we're looking at is a hybrid columbine. This one is Aquigelia. That one's a hard one for me. X hybrida. So this X right here indicates that it is a hybrid. All right, so I'm going to transition away from specifics of plants into talking about how to choose a good plant for a location in a yard. This isn't something you'll be doing on certification visits. Our habitat technicians that go out and do those initial site visits are the ones who make the plant recommendations, but still it's great information for you to know in case you do a certification visit and they ask about, like, plants or what they should plant. So the first thing to do, you've probably heard the phrase right plant, right place. But the first thing that you want to do is just kind of check out the site and let the site help you determine what the appropriate plant what the appropriate plants would be for that site. Soil, moisture, light, topography, and space all determine what plants would do well there. So a good way to think about it is, what's the condition of the site and what are the needs of the plant and how can you match those up? Because we want plants to thrive, not just survive. I've definitely got a few things in my yard that probably would do better elsewhere. They're just like hanging on. And so the point is, if you can find a plant that can thrive in a space, then you're not going to have to water it as much. You're not going to have to fertilize it. So this really makes a difference. One easy step you can do to assess the site to determine what the best plant would be is to look at how much sun or shade there is and how much moisture there is. Is it a dry site? Is it a wet site? And also the topography. Is there a slope? Because different plants will do better at the top of the slope compared to the bottom of the slope. And the plant lists that we'll share with you as resources will have information to indicate what plants are good for full sun, what plants are good for full shade, or part shade, part sun, as well as what plants are good for dry areas or wet areas. So the reference materials we'll be giving you will help you figure that out. All right, one thing we also like to talk about is plant density. What doesn't work well is planting one native plant, leaving 4 feet of space, planting another one. Really, what works best for wildlife and what works best for the plants is to plant densely, not too densely. Plants often come with tags that indicate how much space they need. But honestly, density is a really good thing. And so is clumping plant groups together. So group together the plants that have similar growing conditions. And this is just another way of letting nature guide you. So what we recommend is planting several plants. So like 3 to 5 plants of the same species close together. And when you do this, particularly with wildflowers, you're creating kind of a buffet for pollinators. And that way they don't have to fly from one side of your yard way over to the other side to pollinate from different plants, right? Because they're going to need food from more than one plant. But if you plant things that need similar conditions together, and then wildlife can utilize them more. We also talk about canopy layers. I referred to this a little earlier, but here is a chart to kind of expand on this. So a thing to note, if you look here at this handout, you'll notice that we have listed overstory canopy, understory canopy, large shrub layer, small medium shrub layer, and the ground layer. And over here, you'll notice that there are birds listed for each of these canopy layers. because if you watch closely how the birds interact with plants, you'll notice that some of them love hanging out on the tip top of trees, and others kind of want to feel safe. So they're going to hide out on those upper branches, high enough that cats can't get to them, but also not at the very top. And then others live on the ground. You know, they bop around, they overturn leaves, they look for insects on the underside of leaves. And so they really thrive down here on the ground. And so different layers of canopy attract different wildlife because different wildlife have different needs for food and shelter and nesting. And the heights come into play there. Okay, and so, you know, we talked a little bit about the canopy layers, but just to kind of give you a more specific idea of what we mean by large trees, for example, when we use that term, we're referring to trees over 30 feet. And when we talk about small trees, we're talking about trees up to 30 feet. So once you hit 30 feet, you've got your small trees, and then you've got your large trees on top there. And then large shrubs refers to shrubs up to 20 feet, which is basically as tall as we're, you know, so basically 5 feet or taller, you know. And then small shrubs refers to shrubs up to 5 feet, generally speaking. Ground cover and herbaceous layer, this is just a fancy way of talking about perennials, annuals, biennials, grasses, sedges, rushes. So that's an example of the layers. All right, so there will be a volunteer manual that you'll be getting if you haven't already. And looking to page 29 and looking for pages 29 to 39, you'll find an appendix that is a plant recommendation by condition handout. And on here, you'll find the plants that we most often recommend, the Portland Plant List native plants that we most often recommend. You'll find the condition that they grow under, you'll find their common name, their botanical name, and what conditions they favor. So I really recommend checking that out. All right, we talked about large trees being 30 feet or taller, and here are some examples of those. These are ones that like full shade. We've got grand fir, Pacific dogwood, Pacific yew, and western hemlock. Similarly, for small trees, so these are trees under 30 feet, those that like part sun or part shade are vine maples, black hawthorn, cascara, and Sitka willows, some of my favorites. Then we've got large shrubs that like full sun. They're listed right here, but you can see over on the right under moisture conditions that some of them like moist, and some of them can do either dry or moist. So different options there. And then similarly for small shrubs and ferns. These are really great to plant because they not only provide food for wildlife, but they shade the soil and keep them from growing weeds, which is really helpful. And here are some ground covers and herbaceous layers. So these are in essence, the forest floor. So when you go out to a forest, these are the things that you'll find living on the floor of the forest. So this is where the wildflowers and the grasses are. And ground covers are important because they protect the soil from the force of rain and therefore keep the soil from eroding. And that's great. They hold the soil in place. All right, so let's talk about a couple of fun habitat projects. Native hedgerows. You can't go wrong with native hedgerows. I love them. I recommend them to almost everyone. These are particularly great along fences because what you're looking for is a linear line. I mean, it doesn't have to be perfectly linear, but anywhere where you can closely plant these shrubs. Some of them are actually small trees, and plant them in kind of a row. And the reason for this is that you're providing, like we talked about, planting native plants densely for wildlife, so that once they find those plants, they're able to utilize them without having to go far. And this is the same concept. You're providing a buffet of food for pollinators and for birds. And hedgerows are also really great for nesting, for birds that are nesting. They get a lot of shelter from the hedgerows. In fact, 60% of birds nest in the shrub layer. And so that's a really great thing to know. This is an example. This hedgerow is actually at Galen Beatty's house, I think is where this is from, who is one of the founders of Backyard Habitat. So she did a great job there. All right, next we'll talk about pollinator meadows. Quite a few pollinators, particularly bumblebees, live underground and need bare soil. So I'm just going to put that out there because it's been a craze for a while to bring in a big pile of mulch and mulch everything. And I'm a fan of mulch, don't get me wrong. It's great for preventing weeds. You know, if you clear an area of ivy, say, for example, then if you cover that with mulch, it really helps make sure that the ivy doesn't grow back. So I'm not against mulch, but just make sure, you know, if you want to support pollinators, that you are leaving some, you know, fairly large bare patches, because they do need access to soil to dig down and build their nests underground. But another thing you want to do is select native plants that have bloom times from spring through summer and into fall, because different pollinators come out and feed and live their lives at different times of the year. And so by planting blooms through various seasons, you can support different species of pollinators. It's also helpful if you're pruning back some bushes and you've got some hollow stems, leave those out, create a little pile of them on the ground. And that can be a place for pollinators to lay their eggs and to nest. They also need access to water. So if you have, down here, you'll see a little thing that I have out for bees specifically. It's got water in it. You can have something shallow. Shallow is best, even for birds, because you don't want them to drown, right? So kind of think about, like, you know, how shallow does it need to be to keep the bees from drowning or the birds from drowning, whatever your intention is for that water source. I'm not going to go over this in detail, but I just wanted to show you that there are beautiful blooming options for each time of the year when pollinators are out. So here are some really beautiful blooms, really beautiful native plants that bloom in spring. We've got lupin, currant, yarrow, camas, poppy, and heelall, which I just planted last year for the first time, and I love it. Then for summer plants, for summer bloomers, we've got Douglas spirea, Western columbine, meadow checker mallow, foam flower, and snowberry. And then for fall, we've got Pearly Everlasting, Goldenrod, Douglas aster, yarrow, and harebell. That harebell, by the way, grows really easily. I've got that in my yard, and it just self-seeds every year. So if you're looking for something easy at first, that's a good one. So is aster, but it will kind of take over. So I just want to be careful with it. All right, so let's talk about money. You have lots of extra money lying around the house, right? And you want to spend those on native plants? Probably not. If you're like me, you've got a tight budget for native plants. So like, I'm always looking for the best bang for my buck, right? Like if I have $50 to spend on plants, I want to make sure they're plants that are going to be the most beneficial to wildlife. So this list shows you kind of what native plants have been shown to support the greatest number of birds or pollinators. Well, this specifically is research that was done for birds and mammals. So you can see here that some of the best trees you can plant are vine maples, Pacific dogwood, choke cherry, and Oregon white oak. And you can see here how many birds and mammals they support. And then same for shrubs, blue elderberry, red osier dogwood, serviceberry, and salmonberry are all excellent. And then for ground covers, for smaller plants, we've got miner's lettuce, wood strawberry, red columbine, wood sorrel, and sluice sedge. And I believe this information is directly from the Portland plant list. And so that's another good place to go to look up that information. All right, so fun with math. I actually like math, but I know not everybody does. I'm a little rusty on it at this point. But certification visits do require a little bit of math, not too much. But I'm going to start out with a really cheesy dad joke first. So why do plants hate math? It gives them square roots. All right. Sorry, I know that deserves a wah-wah, but I felt like at this point in the presentation, it would help to get people laughing a little bit. Seriously though, during certification visits, you might need to do a little math, but don't worry, most of the math will be done beforehand by the habitat technician during the initial site visit. And what they do is they calculate some things and then include that in the site report so that you can just pull that information directly from the site report if you're going out to do a certification visit. Let's see here. So the first thing that they calculate is the plantable area, because this is what we then turn around and use to determine whether someone is ready for certification. And basically, in order to calculate the plantable area, we take the total lot size. So we go into Portland maps or whatever county map is available, and we look for the size. We look up that property and it shows us how big that lot is. So we take that number down. And then we figure out, okay, how big is the house? And how big is the garage? And how big is the patio and the shed? And what's the square footage of the sidewalks? And we have different ways of doing that. But we then, those are all that list: house, garage, patio, shed, and paved sidewalks. Those are all what we call impervious surfaces, meaning that water cannot penetrate those surfaces. And those are also areas that the participant is not gonna be planting there, right? Like their house is there. They're not gonna tear down a part of their house to plant native plants. And so what we do is we subtract out these impervious surface areas from the total lot size, which then gives us what's left. And what's left is the lawn area and the area that's dirt with a couple shrubs, like basically everything other than the house and the structures and the concrete is considered plantable area, because those are areas where the participant could plant. So as an example, let's say that someone has a 5,000 square foot lot and they have a 700 square foot home and they have 100 square feet of a paved patio. You would take that 5,000 square foot lot, you would subtract out 700 square feet for the home, subtract out 100 square feet for the paved patio, and you're left with 4,200 square feet. And that is what is considered the plantable area. Again, don't worry about memorizing this. This will be done beforehand by the technician, and it will be in the site report. But questions might come up during certification visits. So it's helpful for you just to kind of know how we calculate it. And this is kind of a visual illustration of what I was just explaining. So the red outlined areas right here, you've got this house, and then you've got this paved patio area, and you've got the driveway, and you've got a sidewalk, and you've got a front entry area. So everything within the red outlined area is considered impervious and is subtracted out from the total lot size. And then everything that's left, everything outside here, back here in the backyard, even this little side yard area, as well as the front yard here, that is considered plantable area because they could take out that lawn and plant native plants. Again, feel free to write down any questions you have about that and bring them with you to the live question and answer sessions. All right, so one question that comes up is, what about planting strips? If a house has a planting strip, and by planting strip, we're referring to a strip of unpaved area between the sidewalk and the street. And so if there is an area like that and they have planted native plants there, that's great. That's extra credit though, because that area is not counted in the plantable area because it's technically owned by the city. It's a right-of-way area. And so so we don't require that the participant plant that area because those right-of-way areas, you never know what the city's going to do. They might come out and tear it up so they can put in some new pipes, or you never know. Usually they don't. It's very rare they do that actually. But still, we want to recognize that not everybody wants to plant that area. So we just make it extra credit. If they do plant that area, great. We'll add that square footage to the area that they've naturescaped. We'll get to that in a second. All right, so the only measuring that you're going to need to do if you go out and do a certification visit is measuring the part of their yard that they have naturescaped. And so when you're measuring, we don't want you to have to carry around a yardstick or a tape measure. That's going a little further than we want to go. We want to keep it a little more relaxed. So what you can do instead that works really great is measure the distance of your step. So for instance, in this image, you can see a lady's taking a kind of a longish step. And we'll just say that one step equals 3 feet. For me, I kind of know how big of a step I need to take in order for that step to measure 3 feet. So I recommend that you do that as well. If you, lay out a yardstick or get someone to help you kind of figure out how long of a step you need to take in order to measure 3 feet. Because then what you can do is you can pace off the length of the naturescaped area in order to calculate the total distance. Yes, so for example, let's say that you show up at a yard and you figure out what area you want to count as naturescaping. And you're probably wondering about that right now, but don't worry, we will get to that after this part. But let's say you've identified like, okay, this part of their front yard, I'm going to count as naturescaping. How do I figure out how big this area is? So what you do is you go to what you would call like the length of the yard. And you would start at one end and you would take those steps that you know equals about 3 feet, and you would count like step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. And then you'd stop and you'd be like, okay, I took 4 steps and I know that each step is 3 feet. And I know that 4 times 3 equals 12. So I know that the length of this naturescaped area is 12 feet long. All right, so you've established one side of the naturescaped area. So now you need to figure out the width. So you go to the area, like if this is the length that you just measured, you come down here because you want to measure the width. So again, you start at one side and you take steps. You take 1 step and you take 2 steps, then a 3rd step. And that's the end of that width of the naturescaped area. So you're like, okay, I just took 3 steps and each step is 3 feet long. So that's 9 feet for the width. So now you know you've got 12 feet of length and 9 feet for the width. So you multiply those to come up with the square footage of that naturescaped area. All right, so hopefully that's clear. You might want to note the time on this video in case you want to come back and revisit it. But that's kind of the general idea. So you're probably wondering in this image on the video if wearing high heels is really a great choice. And I definitely do not recommend it, although it could be handy, in some conditions. But I just wanted to clarify that we don't recommend high heels for certification visits. All right, so we kind of went through this, but I did want to just kind of spell it out really clearly. So again, measure the length of an area. So if you take 10 steps and each step is 3 feet, that's going to be 30-foot length and so forth. And you repeat that for the width, and then you multiply the length times the width to come up with the total square foot. This is probably the topic, one of the topics we get the most questions on. So we will be covering it, I guarantee you, in one of the Q&A sessions. So, all right. So now you have a general idea of how to measure naturescaped areas, but how will you actually know which areas that you want to consider to be naturescaped? So when trying to determine which areas of a yard to count as naturescaped, the best thing to do is to ask the participant where they've planted native plants and which areas they've naturescaped. And that'll save you a lot of time, because they'll tell you like, oh, over here on the side of the front yard, I put all these native plants in, and then you can just like start over there and walk over there and kind of figure out like, is this really naturescaped? And if so, then you can measure it. That will make it a whole lot easier versus you trying to like in your head figure it out on your own, because they know what they've planted. Like, utilize that information. All right, so this is the information. Well, actually, sorry, this is different information. So, when you're looking at, so say you just showed up to someone's house and you've asked them the question like, oh, can you point out to me where you've naturescaped, where you've planted a lot of native plants? And they take you over to an area in their yard and they're like, oh, right here, I've put all this, I've put all these native plants in. All right, so now it's your job, well, your kind of goal now to determine if this falls under the category of what we consider to be naturescaped. So when we use the term naturescaped, we're referring to planting beds that have 50% or more of that square footage taken up by native plants from the Portland plant list. So in this example, you can see here that orange indicates ornamental plants. Green indicates native plants. And they have a few ornamental plants in here, but the majority of the plants are native plants. So this would be a great example of naturescaping. And in this case, the length of the naturescaped area is 8 feet and the width is 6 feet, which means that this naturescaped area is 48 square feet. So you would want to write that down, because they might end up showing you a couple of different areas. So it's good if you kind of write it down and take note of that so you can add up the numbers later. Okay, here's another example. Here's another, okay. This is a new example because now we're going to factor in, remember we talked about canopy layers. And in order to reach silver level certification, a naturescaped or the yard needs to have 3 or more canopy layers. So tree, tall tree, small tree, large shrub, small shrub, or ground cover layer, right? So that would get them to silver if they had 3 of those. If they have 4 of them, they can get as high as gold. And if they have 5, they can get as high as platinum. And so in this example, what we see here is that We've got a large shrub. We've got 4 large shrubs. We have a small tree. H indicates herbaceous layer, so that's some ground cover. And then we have some small shrubs down here. So they have 4 canopy layers. So if they have at least 5% of their yard overall planted with native plants, then they can get silver certification, because that requires 3 canopy layers. If they have 15% of their overall landscaping that's been naturescaped, then they can get gold, because they also have the 4 canopy layers that are required, but they could not get platinum because they only have 4 canopy layers. Now, we wanted to show you what the certification form is going to look like, because if you do certification visits, this is the form you'd use. The first thing you do is write in the total of their naturescaped areas. So we're just going to say that it's 125. And then you pull the total plantable area from the site report, because it will be on the site report. And we'll say in this situation that it's 50%, or sorry, that it's 500 square feet. And then you multiply that by 100 and you come up with the percent naturescaped. So in this case, 125 is 25% of 500. I don't think I said that right, but basically you take 125 divided by 500, multiply by 100, and you get 25% naturescaped. They have, okay, so you've got your naturescaped percentage there. Then we're also asking you to collect information on the number of native trees that they've planted while working towards certification, and also the number of native shrubs added since they've been working towards certification. This is just for our own internal knowledge. This is not used to determine whether they can get certified. This is just information that we collect so that we know what kind of impact we're having on the ground. It's really helpful if we know, like last year we planted through the program, 30,000 shrubs were planted. That's just really helpful for us to know. And just to clarify, this actually refers to shrubs and ground covers. So we've got trees, we're collecting number of trees, and then we're collecting all other canopy layers over here. So shrubs, ground covers, grasses, so forth are counted in this shrub number. Also, just for internal purposes, we're collecting information on whether they have an oak and whether they've oakscaped. Oakscaping is a topic for another day. We'll put together a video to help explain that. This is something the technician does during the initial visit. So the only thing that you have to ask is, have you planted any new Oregon white oaks? Because this is referring specifically to Oregon white oaks, which is our native oak. Or have you installed oakscaping? And they'll know if they've installed oakscaping because it's a very specific thing. So if you ask if they've installed oakscaping and they're like, I'm not really sure, then you're like, okay, they haven't installed oakscaping, because they'll know. It takes research and planning and going out and sourcing specific plants. So if they're like, oh yes, I did, I used that guide that you provided me and it was helpful, then you're like, oh yeah, okay, this person actually did do proper oakscaping. All right, and then down here is where you're checking the boxes as to how many canopy layers they've planted. And in this case, they've planted 4 canopy layers. All right, so that's how you fill out the form, part of the form. And these are probably the trickiest ones, so just wanted to cover that for you. Again, we'll be covering this in more detail at the mock certification trainings. All right, that was a ton of information. I hope you're not overwhelmed because we have many ways in which we support you as you are learning all of these details. And, so please don't let this make you feel like, it's too much and you can't do it or anything like that. Like, it's really fun to learn, and we try to do as much as we can to kind of facilitate your learning, and there's no rush. So you can take as much time as you need to feel comfortable with this information. We do have additional learning opportunities, including our website, backyardhabitats.org. There are lots of classes through the soil water conservation districts, either East Multnomah Soil Water Conservation District or Tualatin, or Clackamas. And so, check out those. The two native plant resources I most highly recommend are the Willamette Valley Native Plants poster by the City of Portland, and Metro's Native Plants for Willamette Valley Yards booklet. And so both of these you can do an easy Google search for and find them online. We can also get you hard copies if you'd like. And then here are some additional learning opportunities. So there's an app called Picture This, which is pretty good at helping you identify native plants. There's some great local gardens to visit: Leach Botanical Gardens in East Portland, Portland Audubon, Hoyt Arboretum in the West Hills of Portland, Ridgefield Wildlife Refuge in Clark County, and PCC Rock Creek, right there where Washington County and Multnomah County meet. We've also got a Backyard Habitat virtual open gardens tour that will be through our blog this summer. And then native plant nurseries are a great resource. If you go to them and they label, it's a really great way to get to know your native plants and native plant sales. All right, so again, please bring your questions with you to our Q&A session. And that is the last slide I have for you. So hopefully this wasn't too painful. Again, it's a lot of fun once you get familiar with it. And again, we just really appreciate that you're watching these and learning with us. And we will see you soon. I will see you soon. Take care.